What makes a great song? This question is asked and analyzed throughout Ready for a Brand New Beat, How Dancing in the Street Became the Anthem of America, the latest book by tonight's guest, the best-selling author of Salt and Cod, Mark Kurlansky. And the answer is the hook. So I had to ask myself when I was preparing for this, what has hooked me about Mark Kurlansky's writing? To know the length and breadth of Mr. Kurlansky's work is to know the ways of the world. Like his literary hero, Emile Zola, Kurlansky's commitments to the facts as well as the heart of whatever he's writing about is always paramount. In his book, Salt, he writes, "The search for love and the search for wealth are always the two best stories. But while a love story is timeless, the story of a quest for wealth, given enough time, will always seem like the vain pursuit of a mirage." In his latest book, there are many tales of wealth found, like the creation of Motown, Berry Gordy's R&B empire, as well as lost, like the neighborhoods of Harlem, Watts, Detroit, and our own nation's capital, Washington, D.C., lost after the urban uprisings that characterized the mid to late 60s and brought a new meaning to the word dancing in the street. However, the other search, the search for love, runs thick through this book, because it's the love that Kurlansky has for the music, for the people he interviewed, and the times they lived. Because it's through their testimonies, coupled with his prose, that we relive the moment, and we feel the beat. And it's a beat that's calling out all around the world. So, without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you a superb writer, a fellow New Englander, such as myself, and a real hero of mine, Mark Kurlansky.
Thank you very much. Before I get started, you reminded me of something we were talking about, having Motown ringtones. I used to have the ringtone of Four Tops, Can't Help Myself. And for this book, I was interviewing Mickey Stevenson, the old A&R director of Motown, one of the authors of the song. And we were sitting in L.A. in this sort of soul food place. And his ringtone, of course, was Dancing in the Street. And we both kept getting phone calls. I'd like to start out by, the case in point. Gordy label, 1964, Martha and the Vandellas, and the credits that Motown never gives. Fred Waits on the drums, James Jamerson on the Fender bass, Joe Messina, Eddie Hollis, and Robert White on guitar, Thomas Bean Bowles on reeds, Earl Van Dyke on keyboard, and that great trumpet intro by Johnny Trudell and Floyd James. So that's what I'm talking about. I always start this way, and I love standing up here and watching feet and heads start to move. You know, if in the past 2 minutes and 36 seconds you haven't experienced an urge for your body to move, you may be dead. It's 2 minutes and 36 seconds because in the 50s, when records went from wax to vinyl, and the music industry became about 45s being played on radio stations by DJs, the DJs said, we're not playing anything over 2 minutes and 45 seconds, which right there completely changed music. It was sort of the end of improvisation and long riffs. And do you know how many times in that 2 minutes and 36 seconds the phrase dancing in the street is uttered? 36. It's called setting the hook. When Berry Gordy, the director of Motown, first heard the recording, he said, that's what I want Motown to sound like. It was a high point in R&B music. John Landau, who is Bruce Springsteen's manager, but used to be a really good rock and roll critic. I asked him what he thought of the record, and he said, it's one of the few records ever made that's absolutely perfect. I mean, everything about it is just exactly perfect. Just an absolute high point with a great backup band of jazz musicians. When I was growing up in America, black people and white people lived in completely separate worlds. This was famously true in the South, but it was also true in New England, where I'm from, and in the Midwest, and in California. It was not only separate schools and separate neighborhoods, but even separate Boy Scout troops, Girl Scout troops, and separate cultures, different senses of humor. Black jokes and white jokes were completely different. And the music was completely different. And the people who performed the music were different. The record companies were different. The stores where the records were sold were different. They was played on different radio stations by different disc jockeys. And in fact, Billboard magazine, which has the charts that determine hits, had a black chart and a white chart. And the top 40 black and the top 40 white didn't look anything alike. The black chart was called the R&B chart, Rhythm and Blues. Rhythm and Blues was black music. There was this huge shift in the African American population of the United States from the rural South to the urban North. And instead of the old rural blues and gospel, the northern music was a much harder beat, electric guitars, and just a much edgier sound. But it was black. White people didn't listen to rhythm and blues. And then, you know, there's this idea started going around about integration. And there were a lot of white people who thought this was a pretty exciting idea, and especially young white people. And there started to be a tremendous interest in black culture and black music. And white people started listening to R&B music. And also you had rebellious white Southern kids going to the wrong side of town. This, you know, in a Southern town was a pretty rebellious thing to do. And listening to black music, picking up black music, picking up black vocalization styles, black dance move, black dress. And, you know, you had most famously Elvis Presley, but a lot of other people. Alan Freed, who was a disc jockey originally in Cleveland and then in New York, and a great promoter of this music, came up with the term rock and roll. And all rock and roll means is rhythm and blues for white people. Yeah, he didn't. Anytime you said R&B, everybody thought black. So he thought, well, let's have a white term for it. So that's what rock and roll was, and it, of course, became tremendously popular, especially with young people, and a lot of controversy. A lot of people really hated it and felt threatened by it. Frank Sinatra felt threatened by it, you know, because, you know, he testified in Congress against it. You know, Frank Sinatra had spent about a decade and a half being the young, hip guy who girls screamed after, you know, and then there's Elvis Presley. And there's a picture in the book of Elvis next to Frank singing together. And, you know, look at the picture, you'll see Frank's problem. And then there were people who just had never had any experience with black music, and so they didn't understand the music. People like Pablo Casals I hate this because I play the cello and I love Casals, but Casals was outspokenly against rock and roll music. But most of the people who are against rock and roll music were white supremacists, KKK, people like that. And what they said, they warned everybody that rock and roll was going to lead to a mingling of the races. Well, you know, Martin Luther King said the same thing. He credited rock and roll and R&B with helping to promote integration. So, you know, you have Motown with Berry Gordy, and you know, this whole thing about white people wanting R&B, you know, wanting black music. This was pretty interesting to people who made black music because the white market was about 8 times the size. And Gordy, you know, he wanted to make black music to sell to white people and make a lot of money. No matter what else he says, Berry Gordy is about making money. And he felt that to do well in the white market, for black people to do well in the white market, they shouldn't raise any kind of controversies or political statements. You know, it's sort of like Barack Obama. If he's going to run for president, he mustn't let on that he has any feelings about being a black man, you know, because white people might not like it. And that was his policy. And he thought he was being very apolitical, except that, you know, he was selling black music to white people, which was at the heart of the issue of integration, which was the biggest political controversy in the country. So in 1962, there's Motown. You know, Mary Wilson, Supremes, used to call it the Motown bubble. Yeah, they were in Detroit, and they had these long sequin gowns and these long Cadillacs, and they weren't really dealing with anything that was going on politically in the 60s. And in 1962, actually, Thomas Bean Bowles came up with this idea that they ought to do a national tour. 94 one-night stands all over the country, including lots of them in the Deep South. So 1962 is the year that SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the vanguard of the civil rights movement, decided to really push freedom rides, black people riding on buses to challenge segregated busing. And here's this bus full of obviously northern black people riding through the South, and they're shooting at them. They're taking shotgun shots, and you know, the people on the bus don't understand what it is. They think we're freedom riders. We're Motown, and my absolute favorite was Mary Wells. Remember my guy? Mary Wells took a drink from a white-only drinking fountain, and a crowd started to form around her. And she looks up and sees this crowd forming, and she thinks, "Oh, they recognize me." In 1964, July 31st, 1964, Dancing in the Street was released 2 days before the official beginning of the Vietnam War, 2 weeks after the first black urban summer uprising, which was in Harlem, of which there were to be many, many more. During the heart of the SNCC summer project that was called the Mississippi Freedom Summer, and 3, Swerve Goodman and Cheney, disappeared, and the search for their bodies was on the front page of the paper every day, all over the country. And there was, people forget how important the 1964 presidential election was. You know, because it was a landslide. It was Johnson Goldwater, and it was a landslide for Johnson. And so, people tend to think of landslide elections as not significant because it wasn't a big tense fight. But that election completely changed the nature of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. 27 million people voted for a candidate who opposed the Civil Rights Act and advocated the use of nuclear weapons, not only in Vietnam, but at the discretion of generals in Europe. So, that's a landslide defeat. It's 27 million people. 27 million people, still a lot of people. So there was a lot of things going on. The Mississippi Freedom Summer was not a success. It registered very few black voters. And the Mississippi grassroots movement formed a delegation to try to replace the all-white Mississippi delegation at the Democratic Party convention in Atlantic City. And the Democrats refused to seat them. The refusal was mainly engineered by Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale. And this created over the summer of '64 a break that was a long time coming in the civil rights movement between the old nonviolent civil rights movement of Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin and the new Black Power movement of Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, who were SNCC. And, June 1964 was when Malcolm X made his famous speech saying, "We will get our rights by any means necessary," which was clearly a rejection of nonviolence. So you have this song coming out at the time of the emergence of the Black Power movement. And you have every summer these uprisings in cities all over the country. By 1967, in the summer of 1967 alone, there were 120 of them. Big cities, small cities, anywhere where there was a black population. This was starting to go on every summer. And here's this song, great dance song. The words are, there's this strong black voice saying, calling out around the world, "Are you ready for a brand new beat? Summer's here, and the time is right for dancing in the street." What's that supposed to mean? And then, as we're dancing in Chicago, it starts listing all of these cities, all of which had volatile, large black communities. The list was done by Marvin Gaye, one of the three writers. And so this song became, first of all, the absolute anthem for the Black Power movement. I mean, it played at every rally, especially by H. Rap Brown. But, it just, it was just part of that movement. It became part of the anti-war movement. I mean, dancing in the street took on a whole different meaning. And was heard in a different way, which, so you get to the question of, was this what they were trying to do when they did the song? And you have to first remember that there is a very old, strong tradition in black music called masking, which is that you have two meanings for a song: the happy, upbeat meaning for the white people and the darker political meaning for the black people. So that it's in black culture that when you hear a song, you listen for what it really means. The famous example, there were a lot of songs in slave times like this, but the famous example was, you ever hear the song Follow the Drinking Gourd? And white people would hear this song and they think, those happy Negroes going drinking. And, black people would hear this song and they would understand that the drinking gourd is the Big Dipper. And if you're in the South and you follow the Big Dipper, you get north to freedom. And that was the tradition of black music. So the three authors of this song were Marvin Gaye, Ivy Jo Hunter, who was a Motown songwriter and musician, and Mickey Stevenson, the A&R director of Motown, the guy who chooses the artists. And, you know, Marvin Gaye would have been the key guy to talk to, except that he was killed years ago, shot by his father. From Washington, by the way, if you didn't know that. And Marvin Gaye was an extremely political man. And he was the one who argued with Barry Gordy for years, saying, you know, we can't just be about love and heartache with all this stuff going on. We have to address these issues. So you have to, you have to wonder. Gordy kept saying, absolutely not. And you have to wonder if he was finding his own way to address this. He did do that list of cities, except for Detroit. He was listing all of the cities, and then Ivy Jo Hunter said, don't forget the Motor City. And it went into the song just like that. Don't forget the Motor City. And I talked to Mickey Stevenson about this, and he was very clear that he thought of it as a political song, only not really Black Power. He said that he and Marvin Gaye watched kids playing on the street in the summertime, fire hydrants, and they were both black and white, and that this was a song about integration. You talk to people in the music industry, and it's almost universally agreed that songwriters can't own the meaning of their song. You hear a song and it means something to you, that's what it means to you. Nobody gets to say, you're wrong. This song has just gone on and on, remained tremendously popular. You still hear it all the time. Its meaning keeps changing. I talked to Sarah Dash, who sang it with Patti LaBelle and Laura Nyro in 1972, and she's absolutely convinced that this was a song about emerging feminism. Got a better one. A review of my book in the Chicago Tribune a couple of weeks ago, the reviewer talked about how when he was in school, he had this teacher who used to use dancing in the street to teach about the westward expansion of the United States. It's a very powerful song, and it's ambiguous enough that it can work for, I always think of, you might be surprised I'm mentioning this, but anybody see Sister Act 2? Okay, admit it, we all saw it. Whoopi Goldberg, hiding out as a nun, tries to raise money for the Catholic school glee club. And what does she do? She goes out on the street in San Francisco and she sings a not bad imitation of Martha Reeves, Dancing in the Street, and everybody gets moving and she hits him up for money. That's what H. Rap Brown was doing too. I didn't actually talk to H. Rap Brown. H. Rap Brown is buried in the worst prison in the U.S. penal system. They call it a super maximum security prison. But we corresponded. And he quoted from William Cowper, the 18th century English poet, who had a poem in which he talked about how you have to have something that fills the sail or you don't get to the other shore. And he said, that's what that song was. In 2001, after the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, Clearwater, the largest radio station owner in the United States, put out a list of songs that would be too dangerous to play, and Dancing in the Street was one of them. The song has been covered more than 40 times by everybody you can imagine, from the Kinks to the Grateful Dead to Neil Diamond to Van Halen to the incredibly weird Mick Jagger, David Bowie version. It's in French, it's in Danish, it's in Finnish. The Library of Congress has an archive of 50 songs that are central to American culture, and this is one of them. And more than anything else, what I was trying to say with this book is that songs, good songs, are important. They're important because they live on and they remind us of who we are, what we came from, and what it was that we aspired to be. Thank you very much.
I'm curious in your research if you came across any other songs that had their original meaning or intended meaning or supposed meaning changed by political events.
I love this question. I get this question all the time. I always look forward to it because this is a very strange thing. The song that has a history most similar to this, although not quite as famous or quite as much of an anthem, is another Martha and the Vandellas song, Heat Wave. Now this is odd because Martha Reeves swears up and down that she doesn't like this political stuff and doesn't want anything to do with it. But Heat Wave was written by three completely different guys, the Holland brothers and Lamont Dossier, and yet it's also all the people who saw Dancing in the Street as an anthem. Their other song was Heat Wave. And there's a book that probably nobody but me ever saw of a collection of anarchist writing, and the title of it is Heat Wave. And the book is dedicated to Martha Reeves, who would be very upset to see it. Marvin Gaye said that Martha Reeves had a very political sounding voice. And she does. You just listen to that. Should we play it again? The opening, that calling out around the world. I mean, there's a definitely political sound to that. Although, I spent a lot of time with her, and I completely believe her that, when she says this is not what she was trying to do at all.
Good evening. My friend Paul Greenberg said to say hello.
Oh, hello, Paul, wherever you are.
Yes, he's in Manhattan. My question is, you're a very prolific writer, and you wrote Salt and Cod. Why did you choose this out of the thousands of topics you might have chosen?
I'll get to them all eventually,
I know that.
Well, a few reasons. Starting with the fact that this wasn't a book idea that was floating around in my head for years and years, from memories going back to my childhood. I was in high school when this song came out. And I loved the song because you cannot dance badly to it. So this was the song I prayed to have come on at school dances, And then, a few years later with the Vietnam War and all the things that happened, I started seeing it differently and started seeing that other meaning for dancing in the street. And so did most of the people I knew. And so I always remembered this song as though it grew up with me. And I always thought this was an interesting phenomenon, but it also, it was a way of, all my book ideas are sort of sneaky ways of getting at something else. And it was a way of talking about the cross-pollination of the struggle for black rights and what happened to music, doesn't get talked about very much that if there had been no civil rights movement, there would have been no rock and roll, and the whole history of American music would have been completely different. So it was a great story that was an opportunity to talk about some things that I thought were important, and that's what I look for in a book topic.
Thank you.
In 1964, In 1964, we were also dealing with the British invasion.
Yes.
And I was wondering, when you're doing your research, what kind of tensions, because it's different beats, literally, between what the Beatles were bringing in, and this was kind of like a fighting back against everything that we were doing with yeah.
Okay, well, a few things. Yeah, 1964 was the year that the Beatles first came to the U.S., also the year that the Rolling Stones first came to the U.S. The Beatles' second tour in the summer of 64, I believe to this day, is the most attended national rock tour that's ever happened. Huge crowds, sort of eerily. John Lennon talked about how scary it was. The way thousands and thousands of people would come at them. It wasn't a total, it wasn't like a totally opposite thing, although it did seem that way to me at the time. I mean, frankly, I didn't get the Beatles. I mean, I just thought, things like Motown and American black music just had such depth to it, and the Beatles were, I Want to Hold Your Hand and all this ditzy stuff, And why were they wearing their hair like one of the Three Stooges? I didn't get that. But the fact is that in a lot of ways, these British groups were based on American black music, on R&B. It's more clear in the case of the Rolling Stones than the Beatles, but with the Beatles also. For instance, how many songs do they slip into falsetto, which is a black vocalization? There was a clear, not only was there a clear influence, but when these guys were interviewed, all of them, Dusty Springfield, all of them, they talked about how their influence was American black music. Mick Jagger, that weird thing he does, the way he moves around on the stage? James Brown. Do you know what he's trying to do?
James Brown.
Yeah, he thinks he's doing James Brown. And I talked to Martha and a lot of Motown people about it, and they had pretty good relations. The British, like the Beatles, bought Motown songs to sing, and they went to the UK and got huge receptions there. They were extremely popular there. And if you go back and you look at the charts in those years, they were completely dominated by British groups and Motown. So it wasn't really a conflict. It was more like two parallel phenomena.
Do you find out what a Vandella is?
One of the many big controversies within the Vandellas. One thing I discovered doing this book, not just the Vandellas, the Supremes, these girl groups, they all kind of hate each other, and you talk to them and they're all like trashing each other. So Martha's story is that Barry Gordy shouted downstairs, said, "We need a name for the group, come up with one in 5 minutes or I'm going to do it." And so Martha came up with Vandellas because it was a cross between Van Dam Street, which was in her neighborhood on the east side of Detroit, and Della Reese. Both Roz Ashford and Betty Kelly and the earlier original Vandellas, there's been a lot of different Vandellas. All the other Vandellas say, "This isn't true at all. Martha didn't come up with it. We couldn't come up with anything," and then Gordy made up Vandellas. And it was a big joke around Motown. What is a Vandella? And don't know what's the truth there.
I know when I talked to like my folks and such growing up, they always said that being rooting for your favorite band was like being part of a gang. Do you have a favorite band, and do you have a favorite song or album from that period that you and if it is Dancing in the Street, maybe your number two, that you like to go back to?
Jeez, I could do a great list of 15 or 20. I mean, just Motown alone. Can't Help Myself. You Can't Hurry Love. I mean, so many great songs. I've always loved the Ronettes, "Be My Baby," which is earlier, Phil Spector. I don't know, I could go on and on. Thank you. Thank you.